Thank you, Manasa. And before doctor says it, we will all vacate and go there.
Before you do that, thanks, Manasa. I'm really impressed. Who's this great guy? I would like to present the president of RCM, Rotarian Mohan Raman, with this set of 3 books which I've written for lay public. It's available on the net and it's free for download. So this is in English and translated into Tamil, not by me, but by Jayashree. And this is for the lay public and it's on head injuries. And this book was actually, the green book was actually released by the president during the MOP Vaishnav Interact meeting on Rotary meeting on World Head Injuries. And then the next one is on stroke and the other one is on brain tumors. So I would like to present this.
Rotary Club of Madras is never undone. Let me present to you almost page to page a copy of our timeless legacy.
Thank you very much. All the best. So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to RCM President Rotarian Mohan Raman for inviting me to Rotarian Vivek, who's away, and of course to Rotarian Manasa, who said many things about me. The only thing true, of course, is that Jayashree rewired my brain. So can I have these lights dimmed so that we can see the slides better? So the brain is a wondrous structure. And it is something which is so fantastic and so complex that we still don't know too much about it, but we know something, and we know more than we did before. So what I'm going to start is from the very, very basic. It is so precious that it is housed in a hard, bony skull, what you see here. And it is got, covering the skull, it has got this, what we think is the skin, but it's not actually skin. It is 5 layers of tissue which is there, and therefore so much protection for this brain, which is actually housed behind the face, above the nose. So anything above here to the back of your neck here, inside is the brain. Most people think it's only here, but no, it's a lot more than that. The best fact is that the brain controls your entire system. In having President Mohan Raman here, I could say it is the Yakunar Sigaram of the organs of the body. So it controls every single part of the body, be it from the tips of your toes, what you smell, what you hear, your heartbeat, your breathing, everything is controlled by the brain. But the way it works is basically through these nerve cells and their extensions, which, if you look at it, is very much like electrical wires. Why do I say that? Because in electrical wires, you have these copper wires, and then you have this insulation on top. And similar to that, in the nerve cells, you have this thin layer, which is called the axon, which is actually the nerve fiber extension. And then you have a layer of fat on top, which actually causes insulation. Very much like our electrical fibers. And better still, the nerve fibers are all grouped together just like electrical cables are. Very similar in structure. And therefore, if you imagine the brain with a lot of nerve fibers, you will see that they're all like electrical cables, and it makes it much easier to understand. But there is one twist to the whole story, because the brain works with a combination of electrical and chemical energy. The way the nerve cell sends a signal down the fiber is through an electrical impulse, which is in microvolts. But then when that impulse reaches the end of the nerve fiber, it then discharges chemicals. And these chemicals are the way one nerve fiber connects to another nerve fiber. And when that nerve fiber connects there, what happens is that, again, electrical impulses are generated. So it's a wondrous balance between electrical energy and chemical energy. But that's not all. The nerve fibers cannot work on their own. So there is a huge amount of support system, just like we heard Rotarian Shesh Sai say, the president is there, he's the face of Rotary, but then you have all the other people, the secretary, treasurer, everybody else there. Similarly, you have a huge number of support systems called the neuroglia, without which these nerve fibers cannot work. So what we have now is that a group of nerve cells which group together, and then they communicate with each other, forming networks. And that is the basic idea of how these brain cells work, groups of cells forming networks, and that's the brain. If you actually look at it, it's like a maze, whether it's electrical wires, computer wires, it looks like a maze when you look at it in electron microscopy of the brain. But when you actually look back, withdraw yourself and take a look, it is actually then made up into tracts which have very well-defined structures. And luckily for us now, with technology, with MRIs, we are able to actually see these nerve fiber tracts going from the brain to the spinal cord, going from one side of the brain to the other, etc. And we are able to understand the function and structure of these tracts, both in health and in disease. Previously, we all thought that certain parts of the brain were responsible for certain functions. For example, the left side of the brain is responsible for speech, the frontal lobe is for doing something, the occipital lobe at the back here is for something else, and that's it. But we now know that when you talk about function, then there are different parts of the brain involved in a single function. For example, if you look at emotion, you would have different parts of the brain firing for emotion. If you talk about speech, I am speaking to you now. So it's not just one part of the brain, of the left side of the brain, which is firing, but different parts of the brain give inputs to certain places, which then allow me to speak and communicate to you the way I do. Same also all other functions, including Mr. Maniratnam, when he directs a dance in cinema, there are different parts of his brain firing. It's not just one part of his brain suddenly lights up and then he says, okay, do that. So that is how it works. There is a huge system of connectivity, of communication of the brain with different parts going back and forth, and that is how the brain functions. And we now know that basically there are core networks which are there, which make us who we are as human beings, for our consciousness, for our awakeness, for arousal. There are some core networks without which we will not be as we are now, talking, smiling, and doing things. Another small important fact, the brain is like an empty refrigerator. It has no storage capability at all. That means that every second that it works, it requires oxygen and nutrition. So though it is only 2% of the body weight of an adult, which is about 1.5 kg, it gets about 15 to 20% of the blood which is pumped from the heart, and consumes almost 20% of the oxygen available in the body. So it is a highly metabolically active organ which is working all the time, taking so much from the body, and is just 1.5 kilograms. So what happens is that because it's an empty refrigerator and it requires stuff all the time to come in, if that flow is stopped, if that supply chain is stopped, then there is disaster. 15 seconds causes loss of consciousness, and 4 to 6 minutes of lack of flow of blood and oxygen and nutrition to the brain can cause irreversible damage, which means that we cannot allow that to happen. So coming to the topic, I've just given you a broad outline of the brain and how it functions. So can we actually rewire the brain? I've told you it is like electrical cables. So we can actually, by re-establishing lost connections, by enabling new connections, and by removing bad connections. So we can rewire the brain by doing all this. And this now, this ability of the brain to get rewired is called neuroplasticity in jargon terms. But basically, we are talking about rewiring the brain. If you look at it traditionally, there are two types of plasticity of the brain. One is a structural plasticity, which means that you have children going to school and they say multiplication tables, 2 2s are 4, 4 2s are 8, things like that, and they keep repeating it, and that gets embedded in the brain, and that forms a structural network, which is called a structural plasticity. By continuously doing something, we keep becoming better at it. By constantly doing some work, I get better at it, and therefore that happens. And then there is a functional plasticity, whereby I'm already doing something, but then I lose that capability due to either disease or something else. And then I need to change the place which takes care of the network. That means I need to create a new network. And that is called functional plasticity. And that is also possible to do now. I will just go on to certain few pathological states which are of interest. For example, epilepsy, which is basically hyperactivity of the brain. In layman terms, I would say it is just a short circuiting of the brain. That's what it is. Very many famous people have had epilepsy, and there are many people, very famous people in the peer group now who have epilepsy, but nobody talks about it because it's a social stigma and nobody wants to talk about it. But it is basically just hyperactivity of the brain. It is basically uncontrolled and exaggerated electrical activity. Think of it that way. For example, if this normal neuron fires 5 times a second, the epileptic neuron will start firing 100 times a second. So what it means is that there is exaggerated activity and it's uncontrolled. That impulse travels in ways it should not be traveling because there is a short circuiting. Just like when you have a short circuit, there is fire. So similarly, that short circuit results in an uncontrolled movement of that electrical impulse. There are different types of epilepsy. We all are common with the term kaka valipu in Tamil, where the patient becomes unconscious, there is frothing in the mouth, there is movement of the hands and limbs. But depending on the place in the brain where epilepsy starts, you can have different types. One type of epilepsy, a person can just suddenly stand still and then resume to do what he does. That 5 seconds, that's an epileptic attack. Certain people will suddenly say, oh, I remember going there, but I don't know how I got there. They will say, I know this place, but they would have never gone there. So these are called different types of epilepsy, jamais vu, déjà vu, and things like that in French and Greek and Latin, but doesn't matter. It all depends on where that irritative focus starts from. The basic treatment for epilepsy is basically, we all know, is medicines. And how the medicines work is to modulate the transmission of impulses. Basically, you reinforce the insulation of the wires which don't have the insulation. Okay, so that's what you do. You just put that insulation tape around the wire, the bare wire, and those are the medicines that you give for epilepsy. And that insulation needs to stay there, and therefore the medicines have to be taken for some time. But sometimes the medicines don't work because the insulation is not enough, or there is a structural abnormality in the brain. That time we need to do surgery because there is an abnormality there and there are abnormal connections going. So we need to do surgery to remove the bad connections which are there in the brain. So there are bad wiring which is there in your house, you have to remove. So you remove that wiring and therefore you stop the epileptic attacks. So this is what is done in epilepsy surgery when medicines can't cure the epileptic attacks. This is just a view, just to break the monotony of my talk by showing you what a modern operation theater looks like with all the monitors and things like that. And that's me operating this huge thing. There is a microscope. So what happens when you do an epilepsy surgery is that this is an epileptic attack. This is an EEG, like similar to an ECG. For the heart, you have an EEG for the brain. And then this is an epileptic attack going there. And at the end of surgery, you have no attacks. And that makes you confident that you have done the right job. So it is very important to do this early, because if you don't do it early, in children especially, It hampers. I told you that an epileptic neuron fires at about 100 times a second, where a normal one does about 5 times a second. Imagine that you run, any one of us runs a minute in under 5 miles, 5 miles in under a minute. At the end of it, you would be like that. You can't move. So how would that brain be able to do any work if the brain is working so fast and abnormally? And that is why, especially in children, the cognitive improvement, the child's brain development is hampered, and sometimes there is even regression of the child's brain's development. And therefore, stopping these attacks in children as soon as possible is extremely important. Sometimes we even do the same thing when it comes to things like facial pain, which is called trigeminal neuralgia, or even for tinnitus, where we go to the nerves here, and then the irritating focus is this normal blood vessel. We use extreme fine instruments and we separate that, and we remove the irritative focus, and therefore the pain or the sound goes away. Just a minute about stroke, which is also called brain attack, which can happen either due to a blockage of a blood vessel or a rupture of a blood vessel. We just heard that one of the past office bearers had something like this. Now, it is very important when something like this happens, you have to act fast. Why should you act fast? The answer is here. 30,000 brain cells die every second if blood does not reach its destination. 30,000 brain cells every second. And that is something which I would want all of you to remember. So the reason you act fast is because time is equal to brain. And therefore, if you act fast, all this area which could have gone dead is then limited to this. And therefore, what happens is that what could be an enormous loss of connections and connectivity and things like that in the brain and networks is now limited to only a little bit. And therefore, you have a lot more salvageable brain. Same also with traumatic brain injury, head injuries. We spoke about it at the MOP Vaishnav, talking to college children, is that your brain in a head injury, however severe or small, the brain is tossed about like a ship in a raging sea. And imagine that happening, your brain is, and when that happens, the brain gets injured, full stop. The severity only changes. And with time, if you do not get it treated, the severity only increases because bad chemicals are released in brain, and that affects other normal nerve cells and fibers. So if this were the electron microscopy of a normal brain with a tightly packed system where the blood vessel, the nutrition and oxygen diffuses into the whole brain and the nerve cells, what happens in injury is this: connections are lost, nerve cells are lost, and therefore the diffusion into the normal existing nerve cells itself does not happen. So what we need to do is that we have to work fast to try and limit the damage as far as possible. A blob of butter you can easily cut, but can you put it back together as that 500 grams? You can't. The butter is there, but you can't put it back together. And similarly with the brain, what is lost is lost. All that you can try is to try and rework the whole system, but you can never get back what is lost. And therefore, my plea to everybody is to limit the loss so that you can work with more. So you need to spot a stroke fast, shift a stroke so that we can save from a stroke and save as much of the connections as possible so that patient can functionally improve. Just a word, how do you recognize a stroke? Be fast. B-E-F-A-S-T, B for balance, E for eyes, F for face, A for arm, S for speech. If any of these have a problem, it's time to call for an ambulance to go to the hospital. Now, I'm just going to shift gears and tell you this interesting story of this young man called Phineas Gage, who lived in the 1800s. He was a foreman in the railways in the US, and he was in charge of blasting through the mountain to lay the railway tracks. So at one time, they were blasting with explosives, and he was a little distracted by somebody or something. And before he knew what happened, this crowbar, which he's now holding in his hand in this photograph, went through his face and through his skull like this. This is just an computer design thing. But this is what actually it went through. He got up in 5 minutes, said, "I'm fine, I'm all right," and things like that. But anyway, he was taken to the hospital. But the doctors there noticed, and his friends noticed, his family noticed that he was different. His entire personality had changed. So then came the whole talk and research and things which led then to functional and psychosurgery. And I'm sure many of you would have seen this fantastic movie, One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, in which Jack Nicholson acted, which spoke about this, about functional neurosurgery, of psychosurgery, which was very good, but then fell into disrepute because of ethical problems. But now, it has come back in a big way over the last decade with a lot of international ethical protocols. The government of India also has got protocols in place. So we can actually reprogram the brain by doing what is called a deep brain stimulation surgery, where electrodes are placed into the deeper parts of the brain, and stimulation the electrical networks makes the brain work better. And this is now being done for Parkinson. We all know that the shaking disease like that, and other movement disorders where there is uncontrolled movement. It can sometimes be done for epilepsy. It is also offered for obsessive compulsive neurosis, manic depression, and things like that. But remember, there are strict protocols for all this for us to get the good result. You can't just pick up a patient and say, okay, I'm doing it. That will end up not the way you want it to end, of course. So, but this definitely, it works like a pacemaker of the heart. So you're actually stimulating the electrical connections that you want to stimulate. So these are the connections. You have positive and negative connections in the brain, in the deeper parts of the brain. So then you can decide, for this disease, I want to stimulate and create a positive impulse. So you stimulate that. Or you say, I want to create a negative impulse. So you stimulate that. And then you get what you want to do. So this is how we actually do it. You put in a frame like almost a space mask, and then you take MRIs, CTs, and then you actually have microelectrodes which record the recordings, the electrical recordings of that area, and then we fix the thing. And if this were the man, you see how he's walking. This is the best he can walk before the surgery. This is a typical patient with a Parkinson gait. His difficulty in turning, his wife has to hold him in case he falls. And then this is the day after surgery, a normal gait, normal arm swing. And this is the beauty of modern technology. It's not something that we are doing fantastic. It's just modern technology and our increased understanding of the brain. And finally, I'm coming to a topic which many people are interested in, which is aging in the brain. Now, what happens when we age? Our hair grows white, yes. Similarly, the brain also tends to age. And that's a normal phenomenon. The normal brain is like this in an adult. And then as you look at this, there seems to be a more of black compared to this, which actually means that in an adult, if this is the normal way of the brain and connections, the connections start getting lost. So the question then comes, how do we know whether it is actual aging or whether, nowadays there's this term which goes on, Alzheimer's and then dementia. So what is it? So if you look at age-related memory problems, these are the common ones. I've met him here. What's his name? Or I'm sure I left my car keys there, but actually you have not. So that is age-related memory problems, misplacing everyday items, easily distracted, forgetting to attend an appointment, accidentally mixing up. My father regularly used to call me by my brother's name. So, these are all age-related memory problems. But the danger signals are when some of this happens. And the most important thing is when you find it difficult to socialize. A Rotarian who suddenly starts becoming reclusive and not wanting to meet other Rotarians. All his life he's been coming to meetings, but then he says, no. That is difficulty to engage in conversation, inability to solve problems, issues regarding completing everyday tasks, feeling confused. Is today Tuesday or is it Thursday? That sort of a thing should then alert family members as to whether it is actually dementia. Now, how do we reduce the risk of dementia? There are 6 pillars of Alzheimer's. Okay, now just a word about this. Alzheimer's is a type of dementia, but all dementia are not Alzheimer's. Okay, so, but these are the 6 pillars of dementia prevention. Basically, regular exercise, social engagement, healthy diet, mental stimulation, and I think that is the most important thing, mental stimulation. The way you keep your brain active is the way you keep your connections going so that you don't lose connections. If you don't lose connections, you will not get dementia. Quality sleep and stress management, of course. So the best way to do all this, learn something, learn a new, I don't believe in this thing of retirement. It is, you retire and do what? Sit at home? And what do? Watch television, sorry. But really, you must learn something new. You must solve puzzles. You must learn a new skill. You can learn it at any age. Read books, start gardening. Yoga is fantastic for brain health and general body health. So all these can be done to prevent your brain from losing connections and therefore aging more than it should. But if something has happened to you, suppose there is a stroke, suppose there is a head injury, suppose there is a tumor, what you have to do is aggressive neuro rehabilitation. And neuro rehabilitation is not just physiotherapy. It is much more than that. Every time we move our hand or legs, every time I do something, there is a signal which goes back to the brain saying that he's doing this like this, and therefore those connections are formed, those circuits are formed. So the physiotherapy, rehabilitation, and what we call cognitive retraining, all that recreates and reconnects parts of the brain, and functional neuroplasticity happens. That means something is lost and then that function is transferred then to another part of the brain. This is an example of a patient who was very badly injured. He was on a tracheostomy in ICU for almost 20 days. Then he had aggressive rehabilitation. But 3 months down the line, he was back at his village doing his everyday work. He's not normal, not how he was before the accident, but he is good to go. So what we do in all this is rerouting the connections. We reroute the wires and we are able to sprout new wires so that we establish new connections. And that is how we can rewire the brain with aggressive rehabilitation, rewiring and interventions so that we enable rewiring. So renewed connections and networks are very much possible. What is like this can become like this. So ladies and gentlemen, rewiring of the brain is possible. An effort has to be made to address problems early and aggressively to do this. And it's because of technological advances that we understand that brain plasticity and new learning can happen all through our lives. It's not that I'm too old to learn, never. You have to keep learning to keep your brain well wired. Thank you very much. I'd love to answer questions. Yes, please shoot away.
Mike, because Zoom people can't hear you.
How does a brain hemorrhage happen? And is the hemorrhage reversible? That's number one.
Okay, I'll answer one by one.
Yeah, sure.
Otherwise, I forget.
I'll refer you to a good doctor.
Sure, please do. Okay, you asked how does brain hemorrhage occur? 90% of brain hemorrhage occurs because of high and uncontrolled blood pressure. That's the most common cause. If you are hypertensive and your blood pressure is uncontrolled, you can have a brain hemorrhage. There are other causes of brain hemorrhage which can be due to abnormal blood vessels. The most common thing would be a bulging, like an old Ambassador tire. If you remember those days, you keep putting puncture, 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 and then that part will start bulging out. So similarly, the weak part of the blood vessel starts bulging out, and that's called an aneurysm. So that is a weak part of the blood vessel, and that can burst, causing hemorrhage. So these are the two main causes. There are other different causes, forget about it, but these are the two main causes. Once there is a bleeding, there is a bleeding. Full stop. You can't reverse the bleeding. You can't say, okay, go back, no bleeding. You can't do that. Now, the question is, what can you do about it? So the thing is, blood inside the brain is inside the blood vessel is very good. Always blood outside the blood vessel is very bad. Basic. Okay? Because what basically happens is that it sort of disintegrates into basic chemicals, and those chemicals are not good. So if it is a huge clot, it will cause pressure on the normal brain, and therefore we have to remove it. So we have to perform a surgery. If it is a very small thing, we don't have to do it. We can treat the patient medically, make sure that everything else, rest of the brain receives good. Now, if there is a cause like an aneurysm, which has caused the hemorrhage, then we have to treat that aneurysm, because if there is something like that, it can burst and the patient can bleed again, and that can be fatal as well. So that is very, very important. And then at the same time, start aggressive rehabilitation to ensure that the patient can functionally recover. Second question.
You mentioned about tinnitus.
Yes.
Now, I do have this issue. It occurred about a year ago. And is it reversible? And
it depends on the cause of tinnitus. 90% of tinnitus is caused by a problem in the ear. So there will be something in the outer or middle ear or the inner ear which can cause it. So in which case it has to be treated accordingly by the ENT surgeons, who will give injections and some medicines and other things. There's sometimes surgery also needed for that. I am dealing with the 10% of tinnitus where the problem is in the nerve. So the nerve is irritated by most often a blood vessel, which lies near it. So we just move that away. So you can't reverse a tinnitus, but you can treat a tinnitus.
Okay. My ENT surgeon says that let it be.
That's a nice song.
I know.
No, it depends. See, it depends on how much it troubles you. See, tinnitus, does it trouble you? If it does not trouble you, you can let it be. Let it be. There is a lady at the back who's been putting up her hand. Hi. I'm worried now. Mic, please, I think. They need a mic, and you need to come in front so that you're seen on screen.
That I can avoid. But my question is, huge buzzwords in the last decade was stem cell research. I know a lot of advances have been made when there has been a transection of the nerve. What about stem cell in cases of Alzheimer's or partial transection, or even when the myelin sheaths are degenerated?
Okay. Stem cells were huge. Actually, we started working on stem cells in the 1990s itself, especially for spinal cord injuries. And then it came on to Alzheimer's, it came on to Parkinson's and all that. Unfortunately, till now, there is no scientific data to prove that it's a working model. So currently, it is not in the clinical sphere at all. As far as the brain is concerned, it is used in orthopedics, it's used in cardiac diseases, where it is proved scientifically, but not as far as the nervous system is concerned. And currently, any work done with stem cells in the nervous system has to be an ICMR-approved clinical research trial. President, whom do I? There are two people raising there. I don't want to be called a favorite, and that too I'm scared of the guy at the back. Mike.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to ask whether there's a susceptibility of, depending on the region or the profession on your brain. For example, they say you have a cardiac problem, Asians are more prone to cardiac ailments. So is there any profession or are there any regions which trigger or which make you more susceptible to any kind of brain disorder or whatever?
Okay, there is no profession which makes you more susceptible. The thing is, the more you work, the better your brain is. So that is one thing. That is out of the way. As far as the demographic thing that you're asking about, as such, there is no demographic susceptibility to general brain disease. There are certain specific diseases which are more common in certain ethnic groups. For example, when I was in Calcutta, we used to see a huge number of brain hemorrhages happening in winter there. And everybody said, yes, that's how it is. Why it happens, nobody knows. The same thing is seen in Kerala as well. It's maybe the fish, because the same thing is also seen in Japan. So it may be the diet, but there is no proof, scientific proof, if you look at it. So as such, we don't use much of our brain on our daily activities. Very frankly, we don't actually think when we are in our everyday morning to night. We don't think. 90% of the 95% of the time, it runs on auto mode. Okay, so that is the main thing. So we actually, even if you are part of that demographic thing, it's not going to actually make sense if you make sure that you are mentally active.
Doc, I'm not sure whether this comes under the purview of neurosurgery or neurology, but I'll still ask this question. I know hemangioma is something which can occur in any part of the body, probably even the brain. But once it is taken care of, is there a chance of it recurring?
Somebody there is answering. Okay. Hemangiomas can occur anywhere in the body. They can occur in the nervous system as well.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, somebody wants to answer that question. Okay, it's an abnormal blood vessel. It's a badly formed collection of blood vessels. I mean, that should be the easiest way of saying it. It is just, it's a blood vessel tumor like thing. That's about it. So it can occur in different parts of the body. It can occur in the nervous system as well. It would have to be operated and removed most of the time. Once you operate and remove the hemangioma completely, that particular hemangioma is removed completely. But if it is part of a genetic predisposition, there are certain genetic syndromes where you can have these hemangiomas. You can get an hemangioma anywhere else again, and that nobody knows.
That's the question I want to ask.
Yes.
Is it genetic, first of all?
Certain hemangiomas are genetic, so there are certain criteria by which we diagnose that, both clinical and otherwise. So, yes, sir.
Doctor, my question is on two aspects. One is the advancement that is happening in the biotechnology, especially the gene editing tools, and there have been some research reports saying that even a patient with HIV's cell was cleaned, and 3 babies were born without HIV in China. It's a story or fact nobody knows. The second thing is the advancement that is happening in the machine learning, especially in the algorithms. For example, this Google's AlphaZero, which could in 4 hours of programming could defeat the stockfish, which could predict about 350 million moves in a second. So how you think is going to help the humans who are best known for their cognitive skills? Will they be replaced by this network of computers?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll tell you as of today and what may happen in the next 5 years. AI is the next big thing. Okay, and AI is going to play a huge role in the management of all types of diseases, including our machines and things like that, our equipment in the operation theater. So there is no two ways about it. But will it replace the human being? Definitely not. Because the human brain is 1 million times more than current what is available in AI. So the permutation combination of networks and things like that is much more. The AI learning is there, but then the AI learning, what we have ingrained in our brains is not only what we learn from birth, but we also learn from generations, which is modulated by social and economic criteria as well. So that is a completely different thing, which we are still not there. But who knows, 10 years from now, it can happen. But personally, I don't think that the human brain can be, it cannot be done away with. The humans will still need to put their 2-bit in for the AI to work in disease. The other question was in genetic. We still not have been able to, at least I don't know, we still not have been able to change the genetic modeling of people that we have not been able to do authentically. But you don't know, research is going on in such a rapid pace that things may be possible. Yes, George.
Okay.
George.
Yeah. So I just wanted to check with you as to what's your take on Elon Musk mentioning about rewiring of the brain if one of the conversations happen. And is there anything which you are aware of, or are there people?
What did he say? I don't know what he said.
Okay, no, he says many things.
He says many things,
Yeah,
that's exactly.
That's the unfortunate thing. But there was a project which they were working on a concept of rewiring the brain.
See, this is basically what all of us are talking about.
Yeah,
What I presented here was a very, very, very basic thing. But what we are talking about is there are certain conditions, there are certain ENT conditions where we can put a chip in the brain and make the child hear. When there is a congenital deafness, bilateral deafness, we can actually put a chip in the brain, and the child can start making out sounds, and that's the beginning of speech. So we have gone to that extent. But can we do it like the what is that guy? Chitty? Can we do Chitty? I don't know. Maybe. Can we do that villain in that? Not Shahrukh Khan, no, that guy, that professor with 4 arms. You know that. So I don't know. Probably it will be possible, but not yet. But that's not actually rewiring. We are actually remodeling certain aspects for you to create 4 arms. Currently in rehabilitation, with my mind, there are machines that with my mind I can actually make something move. That is telekinetic movements are possible. There is a lot of prototypes coming out of that. So with my mouth, I can do things. With my mind, I can actually type out something. So there are things which are happening, and
Thank you.
Thanks, Doc. I think